love to go there and watch it and listen to the band. Just go there and loaf and see it go. Pit, 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 pit. Dear Mrs. Jones, pit, 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 pit. Your chickens laid 16 eggs today. Pit, 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 pit. You know, and Harry Wiley could work that little thing, and it said, boop, 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 number 29 will be 6 minutes late. Then he'd look out the windows. That's why the windows are built this way, you know. And kind of thing.
There was a time when Purcellville was just a smattering of houses built along the dusty turnpike from Leesburg, the county seat. Life centered on a simple country store and post office run, not so surprisingly, by the Purcells. When the stagecoach from Alexandria arrived at tiny Purcell's hotel, people stopped to watch. By the mid-19th century, times were changing. The W&OD Railroad had come to Berlin, Maryland, just across the Potomac, 16 miles north of Purcellville. At Berlin, now called Brunswick, Rodney Purcell could catch a train and order the latest goods from Baltimore or even Philadelphia in person. The customers must have noticed the improvement in stock. The merchants of Alexandria must have noticed also. News reached Purcellville in 1853 of the formation of a competing rail line, the A, L, and H. The first track for the new Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire was laid in 1855. The Alexandria merchants hoped to bring their railroad through the rich agricultural areas of western Fairfax, Loudoun, and the Shenandoah Valley. Via Winchester, the line would terminate in the rich coal-producing area of what is now West Virginia. The route would bring the rail line within 150 yards of Purcell's store. The railroad reached Leesburg by May 1860, and anticipation in Purcellville grew. By March 1861, the route had been graded as far as Hamilton, 3 miles east of Purcellville, and it was time to lay track. But the shots fired at Fort Sumter in mid-April massively diverted attention, and the construction on the railroad ceased. The Civil War soon saw the railroad as the object of considerable military attention. After the war, work picked up on the railroad again, but only gradually. The railroad reached Hamilton in 1873. The next stop would be Purcellville. On March 31st, 1874, as John J. Dillon's Philmont Cornet Band played a lively air, the first locomotive chugged into Purcellville. The crowd cheered as the train came to a screeching, hissing halt. Henry Heaton, a prominent Western Loudoun member of the railroad's board of directors, gave a rousing, welcoming address. Purcellville would never be the same. The train revolutionized the town. Later, that same year, John J. Dillon put down his cornet long enough to build his fertilizer and land plaster facility. Adjoining the track, Dillon's business boomed, bringing the materials to meet the growing needs of Loudoun's increasingly modern farmers. Soon, across the street, a large grain mill was built by Smith and Hurst to grind, store, and ship grain using the railroad, and such was the growth of Purcellville. By the turn of the century, the evidence of Purcellville's prosperity as an agricultural commercial center was everywhere.
The railroad changed names and changed hands frequently. The Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire Railroad, the Washington and Ohio Railroad, the Washington, Ohio, and Western Railroad, the Southern Railroad, the Washington and Old Dominion, extending only 7 miles beyond Purcellville to Bluemont in its heyday, never reaching the lucrative coal mines of West Virginia. Its main users became the farmers and merchants of Loudoun and Fairfax counties. For farmers, the railroad proved a vital link to Washington and Alexandria. Grain and milk could be sent rapidly into the city markets without an excruciating trip by wagon over still rough roads. Farm implements, fertilizer, lime, feed, and seed were brought to the area farmers by the carload. These were unloaded on a site near Purcellville Station over several days. Passengers made up a less important, but nevertheless substantial part of the railroad's business. There were commuters into Washington, or at least as far as Roslyn, where you could hop a streetcar that would cross the river into the city. Some just had business or pleasure in the next town down the line. One customer recalls returning home to Bluemont from a music lesson in Purcellville. Another remembers hitching a ride illegally to visit an uncle in Peonian Springs. Many went shopping in Leesburg. There was an occasional trip to Washington to go shopping and see a picture. In the summertime, heat-punished city folk used a train to escape to the country. Some came to stay a while. Purcellville and surrounding towns had hotels and boarding houses, such as Hampton's Hotel, still standing in downtown Purcellville. These offered a chance for visitors to relax or explore the countryside. A short carriage ride from Purcellville Station was Silcott Springs. It drew those in need of a mineral bath to make their vacation in the country complete. In midsummer, thousands of Northern Virginians flocked to Purcellville by rail and carriage to partake of a renowned local institution Bush Meeting. Where the Purcellville roller rink and Fireman's Field are today, Bush Meeting was a week-long prohibition meeting, religious revival, and carnival all rolled into one. Hundreds could be seen walking to the train station after a particularly big evening of events at the Bush Meeting. Similarly, the Sunday nearest September 22nd, Emancipation Day, drew large numbers of black Northern Virginians to a public celebration at Emancipation Hall just south of town. It was common for salesmen to come to town on the train. A short walk to Hampton's Livery on Depot Street would procure horse-drawn transportation. From there, these drummers would make the rural round, taking orders for a variety of products. Local businessmen had freight shipped in on the railroad. The hardware store might order nails or barbed wire. Purcellville Motors might take delivery of several new Model T Fords. Materials for the cinder block plant were brought in. Coal was unloaded just east of the station. A youngster might see the new bicycle ordered from Sears and Roebuck arrive. The train was also used to deliver and take up mail. Mail picked up in Purcellville with Round Hill or Bluemont addresses could be sorted in 7 minutes before reaching the Round Hill station.
In the early days, the W&OD was steam-powered, and the mournful cry of the steam whistle could be heard as the train made crossings and finally worked its way into Purcellville. The line was electrified in 1911 through 1912 when it merged with the Great Falls and Old Dominion Railroad, a suburban excursion line. Now, instead of the traditional locomotives, glorified trolley cars known as interurbans made their way west from the city, powered by an overhead arm attached to a live wire strung above the track. When the railroad chose to cease passenger service in 1941, they took down the electric lines and purchased several small diesel engines to handle freight. When World War II forced the resumption of passenger service, diesel and gas electric cars were employed. For the rest of its life, diesel would dominate the W&OD. Many remember riding the W&OD. It had a number of nicknames. It was the Virginia Creeper and the Wait Over the Doze, but it was always an important service to those along the line. Most remember riding on the electric interurban cars. Their memories include the many stops at rural platforms, especially on the morning milk train, when 10 gallons of fresh milk would be exchanged for empty ones. They remember the direction of the seats being changed at the end of the line. The traditional conductor, complete with blue uniform, came by to punch your ticket. As no food was served on board, most going the full distance to the city would bring a brown bag of snacks. A toilet was available. You could see the moving tracks when you flushed. Of course, the toilets were locked when going through fussy towns. In the winter, one coal stove at the end of each car provided the heat, hot in one end, cold in the other, and all speak of the constant swaying motion of the cars. While most recall that the train was not always on time, a train schedule simply stated departure and arrival of trains at times stated not guaranteed. Few can remember being much upset over it. The train station in Purcellville that people remember is the one still standing, a combined freight and passenger depot designed in late 1903 and constructed sometime the next year. It replaced a thoroughly 16-foot by 30-foot passenger depot beside a 20-foot by 60-foot freight building built in 1874 when the railroad first came to town. In the present building, the western half was used for incoming or outgoing freight. A boxcar would be pushed on a side to load or unload the south side of the building over a 3-day period. The eastern half of the present station contained a ticket and station agent's office with a bay window for good view of the tracks. It was flanked on the west side by a small, simple waiting room for blacks and a larger one on the east side for whites, reflecting the racial segregation of the times. The larger white waiting room was vastly more used and remembered. Through the ticket window which faced the waiting room, you could see the station agent, who was also a busy telegrapher. The constant railroad and commercial telegraph traffic kept the station agent busy and gave the room a click-click-clicking sound. While there were seldom large numbers of people in the waiting room, young men found the waiting room and the station a popular place to loiter. With luck, the station agent would need help with the freight, and a little pocket money could be had.
It always seemed that the W&OD was in trouble. After the First World War, the railroad was financially strapped by its rural Northern Virginia route, and it was fined by the State Corporation Commission for Safety and Service Violations, who concluded that under the current conditions, the W&OD could not give the public reasonably safe, adequate, or dependable service. Throughout the 1920s, despite the W&OD's efforts to attract passengers with spruced-up cars, the numbers of riders declined. Hauling freight came to be the mainstay of the railroad. By 1929, the W&OD had recorded 17 straight years of losses, with 10 straight years of diminishing revenues. In 1932, the railroad went into receivership, thereby having a court-appointed guardian oversee its finances. Passenger traffic had plunged from 1.8 million in 1920 to only 396,000 by 1932. The Depression and the explosion of low-priced automobiles in the 1920s were killing the little railroad. In 1938, the railroad applied to the State Corporation Commission to be permitted to end all service beyond Purcellville. It was granted in early 1939, and the tracks from Purcellville to Bluemont were torn up. Purcellville became the railroad's western terminus. In 1940, the W&OD applied to the State Corporation Commission to end all passenger service, citing company records that showed average passenger profits at less than $40 per day, with ridership down 96% since 1919. In 1941, with state approval, the W&OD's last passenger run, Purcellville to Roslyn, was made on April 12th with 69 passengers. In early 1944, World War II commuter needs brought back passenger service to Purcellville on a temporary basis. In 1951, 6 years after World War II, with wartime ridership almost gone and a postal contract expiring, the W&OD made its very last passenger run with a single car on May 31st. In 1968, after a short-term boom with the building of Dulles Airport, the W&OD was given permission to cease operations altogether, which it did on August 28th. The nation's attention was diverted by riots during the Democratic Convention in Chicago that same day. Engines, cars, and stations were sold shortly thereafter, and the tracks were torn up locally in 1969. The car and truck had won the battle for dominance in the Northern Virginia transportation game. Still, many in that tumultuous summer of 1968 had cause to question the future without the W&OD. Might not we need a commuter rail in the future due to clogged highways? The dueling of Route 7 that year told most that such was not the case. At any rate, the W&OD was not interested. Tired, destitute, and all but broken, the little railroad gracefully slipped into history.
I can remember just before the train came, they would pull up the carts to get ready to load them on whatever they had on those big carts. And I knew the train was coming closer then because they would pull the cars up closer to where they had to unload at that time. And then the man with Mr. Merchant with his mail would be ready and waiting to load that on the train or take it off.
Okay. Now this is where Mr. Wiley had his little office in here, and he would sell you a ticket right here. He was a big old fella. I think if I remember, he chewed tobacco. And of course, like all those old timers, it didn't all stay inside. It was kind of some on the outside, down around the edge of his lips. And he talked with sort of a slur, but he ran the station here by himself. He didn't have any help. Whatever got done, he did.
And then there was a seal on the car that was theoretically not supposed to be broken until the money was in the bank. But the freight agent here, Harry Wiley, my father had a pretty good relationship, so we didn't worry too much about that little aspect of it. But he just started working and hoped that it wasn't too hot. Because the more you unloaded, the further you had to go back in the car, and then it got hotter and hotter and hotter. And you got tireder and tireder.
It was, and I went to sleep many a night listening to choo-choo going to Hamilton. You hear it fading, you know, and if you hear it fade, it made a little boy just go whoom right like that. He'd fall right off. It never got to Hamilton.